Does FTP really matter, or is it just something that you can use to brag to your mates? This is a good question, and one that we're going to tackle a little bit today. First and foremost, I'm going to lay this out. If you are not really that bothered about improving or performance as a cyclist, then hands down, I'd probably say that doing FTP tests is inconsequential to you and it's not really of any value. However, if you are looking to improve, there is definitely an argument that you should be testing your FTP reasonably regularly. And how regular, we will come to that in a bit. Secondly, I am absolutely obsessed with stats. It's part of the reason I love Zwift racing. It's part of the reason I love cycling as a whole. I understand that if you take all the information that you are given, you can use and interpret that to help your own performance. And this is a bit of a humble brag, but back many years ago, about 10 years ago, I set a world record for running 12 hours solidly on a treadmill. Now, that's not to say that I was the best person in the world at doing it, or certainly the best or most capable person when it came to doing it. But what I did realize was that if I took all my information and used it to the best of my knowledge, I would actually be able to outperform my own kind of actual ability as a runner. So I realized that I had to reduce my ground resistance force, and I had to reduce the amount of time my foot spent on a treadmill. Lo and behold, I managed to run 94 point something miles in 12 hours solidly to set a new world record. Hey, humble brag. Anyway, my point is that if you take the information available to you, you can use that and interpret that in a way that is definitely going to help your own performance. So let's circle this all the way back round to knowing your FTP. First and foremost, I think FTP as a value within itself kind of only holds a reasonable or a small part of the puzzle itself. I think you need to take that number and be able to apply that to your own cycling. And what do you mean by that? Let's, for instance, say you are doing an esports race, or you are riding outside with a group of mates and they are going quite hard. In that instance, you want to be able to look at what watts you are putting out and then kind of relate that back to what that should feel like in terms of your own performance. I mean, if your FTP, and we're going to use some round numbers for you, is 200 watts, and you are outside and you're putting out 250 watts, or you're racing and putting out 250 watts, you should mentally be feeling like this is really hard work, and I need to try and find a way to not be putting out as many watts and try and stay with the group. Lo and behold, a huge part about esports racing anyway is just trying to hold the group. The dynamics outside are slightly different, but the principles are reasonably the same. So being able to have your own FTP is incredibly important because first and foremost, it gives you an idea of how you are performing relative to what your ability is. In much the same way that when I go out running and I kind of use my pace that I know relative to a 5K, a half marathon or a 10K, and apply that to the speed that I'm running at that time relative to the distance. With an FTP, you can do a similar type of thing. Take a little snapshot of how you are performing in that moment and just see whether you are above or below. Now, the whole point of an FTP is, in theory, it is meant to be a close representation of your LT2, your lactate threshold, the second point where your lactate threshold spikes aggressively and you are not really able to perform for a huge amount of time when you are over that kind of LT2 mark, when you're over your FTP. So this is another good point, is that if you have an idea or if you are able to test regularly, and when I say regularly, I am talking kind of 8 weeks, I would imagine, every couple of months, try and get a good FTP test in there. And people, you can argue about which FTP test is best in terms of a 20-minute or a 60-minute. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that the FTP ramp tests don't always provide the best results, but they are the ones that I find the easiest, so the ones that I end up doing the most often, and then I just reduce the output, the figure that it does provide me a little bit, to take things or tailor it back a little bit, because I know that it tends to over exaggerate what my performance is. But let's circle back round. If you can keep a good idea on that kind of LT2, that point at which your lactate is spiking, or that theoretical kind of LT2 point using an FTP, you yourself are going to get a very good idea of how you are performing and whether you are improving. I think as cyclists, sometimes we are a little bit guilty of going through the motions of training really hard and thinking that every time we do a hard training session, that can lead to improvements, when it's not always the case. It can ultimately lead to fatigue or overtraining or central nervous system problems or hormonal problems, and then we actually don't end up kind of getting the result that we want. And I've seen this time and time again with athletes that are trying to improve, and I am most certainly there myself, where I'm trying really hard to improve now, but it is the overstretching and the overtraining, or the overstraining, if you will, of my training that is causing me to not actually improve as a cyclist. I'm kind of just flatlining a little bit, and that's something I have to address on my own terms. Anyway, I'm going to dive into an FTP test in a minute, but the thing that I do find funny about FTPs that perhaps we need to pay attention to is they're not always going to be relevant to everyone. I think putting too much emphasis on doing FTP tests is probably not appropriate to everyday cyclists, people that are kind of out and enjoying big group rides. But I would say that knowing a rough idea of your performance value is a really good way to get into kind of helping you improve a little bit. So let's say you are a reasonably new cyclist who's been cycling 12, 16 months. You've never really done an event or a sportif or anything like that. If you take the time to jump on a trainer or use some sort of online training platform, then you are going to be able to get an idea of what your FTP is, and that's going to help you improve in terms of just trying to tailor your training for a race. And that is the nicest thing about knowing your FTP, is that when it comes to training, you can really dial in your sessions. You'll have a really good idea of the type of figure or the type of watts that you should be using for a certain period of time, and what is kind of going to be applicable to you. And you'll also understand when you're not hitting those watts that perhaps something needs to change in terms of rest and recovery. So I'm going to dive in and do an FTP test now, and you're going to see where I am in the start of January for 2024 when it comes to my first FTP test. Don't shout at me, guys. It is a ramp test. It's all I can manage. I have a lot going on at the moment. So here we go, my FTP ramp test, and I'll dive back in with you in a second. So I love these little moments because it lets me have a good chat with you about everything that's going on in my head. First and foremost, guys, let me give you a quick rundown on how my previous FTP tests have gone for me. Typically, I've managed to make it through to around the 400 watt mark. The way that the step test works is you do a minute at each wattage, and then the watts will increase by 20 watts at a time. So you've got to survive a minute, and then you will add 20 watts. So effectively, it progressively gets harder, but even though it does kind of progress in equal increments, like 20 watts each time, the strain it puts on your body is then kind of incrementally harder. It becomes so much more difficult. So basically, long story short, everything is going fine until it's not. That is the principle of a step test. For context, because context is important, for my last few FTP tests, I have made it all the way through the 400 watt mark. I've done that minute at 400 watts. Then I've lasted between 25 to 35 seconds on the 420 mark. So that's context for you. That's where I was at when I last did this, which I think was around November time, was the last time I put out some decent watts. Then on a step test, my result was 311 watts. So there you go. That's where kind of I am. I know that my December and my January has not been particularly strong when it comes to cycling, but I was kind of feeling that perhaps I might be in half a shot of actually kind of improving, or at least not having kind of taken too many steps back. I might have mentioned it, but I am doing a lot of running now, which will or has certainly affected my body. So whatever happens with this test, I think information is just so valuable. It's something that I really do kind of make the most of. I think being able to understand ultimately what your goal is, because a goal is just fundamentally you are just listing out a series of information about what you want to achieve. So you might as well take all the information you have with what you are at now, and I hope that makes sense for you. I actually found this particular test incredibly hard. I think just having increased volume, especially off the bike and doing big run sessions, has just made it really a struggle, shall we say. This was taken on a Monday morning. I've just done my park run on a Saturday, 5k run. I did my long run on the Sunday, and then I did a short cycle ride in the evening. And then Monday I do the FTP test, and I do a Monday, I actually go for a run after this, and I go and try and do a race, and that race goes horribly wrong. So it is no surprise that I'm putting myself under way too much stress at the moment, and it is one thing I would try and encourage you to do, which is take some time off before doing an FTP test so you can create an equal and even environment over other times you've done it. And that's the advice that I obviously have not followed when it's come to doing this one. I was finding this particularly hard, and first and foremost, like, I just don't think my heart rate gets very high, which is a classic sign of fatigue, like neuromuscular fatigue. I can't get my muscles to work hard enough, that ultimately means that my heart needs to pump harder to provide them with more oxygen. That's basically the net result of how I feel like this turned out for me. But again, this is all really good and relevant information, because ultimately, you know, I've turned 40 last year, or 41 last year, and so I'm not a 22-year-old anymore who can just get on a bike, smash it, do this, do that, you know, and you kind of just steadily improve. And then you kind of only have to really worry about things when you're trying to get the real tip of the sword to be nice and sharp. I'm having to worry about information every single day, having to worry about my ability every single day. So we're up to about 340 watts, and I'm not going to lie, I was finding this a struggle. It's not too abnormal for my heart rate to be at 154. I will see whether I can flash up my last HR from my previous test now, just so that we can get a good idea of what that is compared to, because that's the nice thing. Again, like I said, have as much information available as possible. I like to record my FTP tests, and I can actually compare them to previous efforts. But yeah, I need to take as much information about my cycling and my training away with me as possible to help me improve. I think if being way more efficient nowadays is just so much more beneficial to me than just kind of thinking like throwing, you know, mud at a wall and seeing what sticks in terms of training, like you can when you're in your 20s. You can eat what you want, you can train when you want, or not necessarily. I am being a bit facetious, but you know, you understand the basic principles there. So the more information I can take away from this, the better. And if I basically realize that my FTP has taken a big step down, then I've got to kind of think, well, what has caused that? And that's another nice thing. Then I can either address that and try and kind of change it and just really kind of figure out what I want to focus on. But if I haven't done this, or I didn't do this, then it's something that I wouldn't really know. It also means that when it comes to bike training sessions, whatever happens to my FTP, I can readjust the intensity of my training that's kind of more relevant to my ability at this time. So, you know, even though I want to ultimately get to an FTP of kind of, you know, 420, 320 watts, you know, that's just pointless saying that if I'm not kind of taking in the information of where I am now and how relevant and how hard I can work. You can basically see that I basically blitz it through the 380 mark, and I am done. I really struggled. I am almost 2.5 minutes away from my previous times. So guys, I'll catch up with you in a second, but we'll chalk that one up as a disaster. I think we can chalk that one up to being a bit of a disaster, but I'm not worried about it too much. I know that my volume's high. I am trying to incorporate more ultra run training and trying ultimately to put a lot of volume through my legs in terms of running as well as cycling. So I need to kind of really get back to the chalkboard from my own perspective and readdress kind of what I want out of this year, especially when it comes to cycling. I am also aware that we are in the UK, the depths of winter, so performing at this time of year just isn't really that relevant to me or important to me. I'm not too bothered about performance just yet. I think building a nice solid base, putting miles through the legs and just kind of enjoying it is probably the main part. I know that when the summer comes, I will be outside more, participating in different events more, and then I will naturally progress and try and bump things up, and I'll get a bit more competitive and be able to spend more time on the bike. So I'm not panicking just yet, but that was an absolute disaster. It is I don't want to say a huge step back, but it is certainly a large step back. My training volume in terms of running has been high. My training volume in terms of cycling has not been, it's been a bit middle ground. I'm not necessarily kind of focusing on one over the other. We are gonna, for the next few months, incorporate both. But lo and behold, I do have some decisions to make and some work to do. Guys, thanks for sticking around. I will see you guys on the next one. do an FTP test, use it to structure your training, and use it to take valuable moments of information about how you should be cycling when you are out in groups or out in races or out in events, because I actually do really enjoy or really think that a FTP or knowing your FTP is hugely valuable information.